By far, the most popular method Christians use to support a lack of evidence for the magical stories of Jesus is to comb through the Old Testament and point out anything that sounds remotely like him, saying, "Here it is, here is the proof. It was prophesied hundreds of years beforehand in the Old Testament." Okay. Before we examine some of these claims, I think it is very important to first note how these so-called fulfillment prophecies have caused much resentment from Jews who argue that Muslims and Christians have piggybacked and perverted their religion. There is not one single verse in the Old Testament describing a resurrection of God's only begotten Son, a Trinity, or a promise of eternal heaven for those who believe, or hell for those who don't. A Christian theology simply does not exist in the Old Testament. A Jewish rabbi, Michael Skobac, once said, "If Jesus is what people are looking for, they will see him everywhere and in everything." I remember seeing a man hold up a piece of toast, claiming that it revealed the image of Jesus. These folks are simply looking at the world through Jesus glasses. In this way, Christians have been farming the Old Testament with their Jesus glasses on, and Jesus is popping up everywhere. Likewise, if you were to comb through all the Harry Potter books looking for anything that sounds like Jesus, you could turn up hundreds of resemblances. This farming method is exactly what Christians have done with the vast majority of these fulfillment claims, in which most don't even merit my analysis. In this video, I will be focusing on the problems associated with the more popular prophecies claiming to have been fulfilled by Jesus. Let's begin with Isaiah 7:14 through 16. This is one of the most popular fulfillment claims made by Christians and is found referenced in the New Testament book of Matthew. "Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." The Hebrew word for virgin, Alma, is translated as young woman, but the American Standard and King James render Alma as virgin. For an example of this, the book of Psalms also uses the same word, Alma, in reference to young girls who are playing timbrels in what appears to be a religious ceremony. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them virgins playing tambourines. Translating Alma as virgin rather than young woman is a premeditated attempt by early Christian scribes to weave Jesus into the Old Testament. However, this fulfillment claim turns out to be a complete blunder when we actually take a closer look at what Isaiah actually says. In the book of Isaiah, King Ahaz, the king of Jerusalem, is concerned about two aggressive kings from Damascus and Samaria who have banded together and are planning to invade Jerusalem. King Ahaz is very frightened. So the prophet Isaiah tells Ahaz that God will save him, and this will be God's sign. "Behold, a virgin," or young woman, "shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings." What God is telling King Ahaz is, When this young woman gives birth, and by the time her child reaches an age of recognizing good from bad, probably around the age of 7 or 8, the nations that King Ahaz is fearing will no longer be a threat to him. You see, this child we are speaking of is to be born in King Ahaz's day, and this sign is only for Ahaz, to reveal that God is with him. This is why God instructs the child to be named Emmanuel, a Hebrew name meaning God with us. This passage is not referring to a future time or Messiah. Isaiah also says, "Butter and honey shall he eat." Butter and honey were exclusive privileges and extremely expensive luxuries. This certainly does not describe Jesus' poor or modest upbringing. This was describing a child that would be born in the king's household. However, this does not deter the author of Matthew. In an attempt to force Isaiah into being a Jesus prophecy, the author of Matthew had to do a little editing. Matthew changes the text in Isaiah by inserting the word "they," and "they shall call his name Emmanuel." The reason he deliberately adds "they" to his text is because Jesus was named, well, Jesus, not Emmanuel. By inserting "they," he could deceive readers by making it sound like the world would be calling Jesus Emmanuel as some kind of metaphoric reverence. You see, the original text insinuates that the boy's mother or King Ahaz would name the child Emmanuel. It is not written as some mystery metaphor for a future Messiah, but rather a clear instruction for King Ahaz. As I have shown here, New Testament scribes will deliberately edit Old Testament scripture and remove them from context in order to achieve their agenda. Need more proof? Let's take a look at Zechariah 12:10, another very popular fulfillment claim made by Christians. "And I will pour upon the house of David the spirit of grace and supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son." Wow! This one really does sound like Jesus. However, let's look again at this passage, only this time focus on the pronouns I have identified with bolding and underlining. "And I will pour upon the house of David the spirit of grace and supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son." Who is the him? If Jesus is the me, can the pronouns me and him as they appear in this passage refer to the same speaker? The answer is obviously no. This would be an absurd and incorrect use of grammar. The prophet in Zechariah is speaking of two distinct entities. The author of John, who writes the fourth gospel in the New Testament, realizes this problem and deliberately alters his text. "They shall look on him whom they pierced." The author of John wanted the pronouns to be in agreement, so he changed the first pronoun from me to him. He is clearly manipulating this Old Testament text in an effort to weave Jesus in. What Christians are actually doing here with Zechariah 12:10 is focusing in on anything that sounds like Jesus, and then cherry-picking it out from the original context. They will pay no attention to the entire chapter of Zechariah 12, but seem only drawn to the word pierce within it. If the word pierce were not used here, they would likely pass this verse by unnoticed. However, in those days, being killed was nearly always by means of being pierced by a sword, spear, or any other form of deadly object. The word pierce seems to excite Christians by reminding them of Jesus having his hands and feet pierced on a cross. Let's dig deeper into the context of Zechariah 12 to discover what this passage actually means. In Zechariah chapter 12, verse 1 and 3 tells us that there will be an attack against Jerusalem by every nation of the world. Verse 3 says, all the people on earth will be gathered against Jerusalem. As the narrative continues, Jerusalem is attacked, and God destroys all of the world's nations. And then we reach the famous verse 10, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced. The main problem for Jesus is that none of these end-time global events happened prior to his arrival or execution. Jesus simply does not fit the chronological order of this context. Therefore, Christians must begin fabricating a new interpretation. In addition to this, Zechariah is describing the him as someone who dies in this great battle against all the armies of the world. In the very next verse, verse 11, the sadness in Jerusalem over this person's death is compared with the sadness in the valley of Megiddo, which is reference to the death of King Josiah, the last righteous king of Judah. This is a clue. Zechariah is speaking of a greatly loved Jewish king, a Jewish Messiah, who will ultimately die in this great battle. Jesus does not die in a great battle against all the nations on earth. Nor did the Jews experience a great sadness after Jesus died. To the contrary, the majority of Jews never even converted to Christianity. They weren't buying it. Nor was the Christian community saddened by Jesus' death, but instead have rejoiced and refer to it as the good news. In order for this passage in Zechariah to be describing Jesus, it must be plucked out of context and reworked, remain unfulfilled, be grammatically incorrect, and or confusing. It is more logical to consider any similarity to Jesus, primarily the word pierce, as simply coincidental. Let's take another look at just how likely it is that these kind of coincidences will occur. In the very next chapter of Zechariah, we find another similarity to Jesus. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Wow, that really sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? If we have any Christian read this verse out loud and then ask, who is this scripture talking about? They most likely will say with a cheerful glow, it's Jesus, of course. However, they would be gravely mistaken. In fact, many Christians have accidentally quoted this verse out of context in order to support a messianic agenda, but suffered much surprise when learning who him with the wounds in his hands is. In verse 2, he was cut off from the land because of abominable teachings. In verse 4, he is ashamed to have taught a false religion and a false god to the people. He was a false prophet. Here we see firsthand how coincidence will occur, and how easily we can be fooled into believing something is referring to Jesus when in fact we are just simply looking at everything with Jesus glasses on. If we are not very careful, we can find ourselves involved with plagiarism, taking another author's words out of context and using them for another purpose, or text altering an author's work to support a new idea is now a crime. Speaking of plagiarism, with the recent discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, which do not contain any books from the New Testament, historians are able to see just how important it was for Jews to keep a careful copying process of Jewish scripture. If there is a God who miraculously revealed the Dead Sea Scrolls in order to authenticate his word, why did he not include anything about Jesus or the New Testament? The overzealous number of magical Jesus stories could certainly use a little more credibility. Regardless, the Old Testament is very clear about not changing a single word of sacred text. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take anything from it. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. These are passages in the Old Testament in which Christian scribes seem to have profoundly neglected or even abused. Christian scribes have done exactly what the Jewish prophets warned the Jews to beware of. Jews have been consistent from the very start that Christianity is nothing but a superstition bearing no resemblance to their faith. For a Jew, Christianity is not a Hebrew faith, but rather a Greek-inspired pagan adaptation. Ironically, neither was the New Testament penned in Hebrew, but rather all 27 books were written in Greek. My friends, I do hope I have helped to open your eyes concerning this often ignored subject. There are many more to examine. Please continue with Part 2 for the problems associated with other popular fulfillment claims made by Christians. And stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems. I don't care what they sold you. They are not here to